Okay, so it's recording now. I am going to start talking a little bit here. And what we are going over today, it would help. Sorry, hang on one second. You'll just have to hear me talking to myself in our recording because I'm not projecting to class, which would be helpful, right? So just give me a second here for it to load. There we go. Perfect. Now, when I say specialized tissue in plants, I just want to remind you that plant parts are different than plant tissue. Plant parts are made of tissue, okay? So we'll talk about a few types of tissue today, and then no matter where we're looking in the plant, you should be able to find those types of tissue, okay? Now, this will make more sense as we get going into this, okay? So just as a refresher, okay, the three principal organs and tissues that we're going to be talking, or the organs that we'll talk about, okay, are roots, stems, and leaves. Flowers are also important structures, but remember, plants don't always have flowers, right? So plants only grow flowers during cycles of reproduction, okay? Some plants have flowers more often than others. Some plants don't flower every year, some do. It really just depends, okay? So we'll talk about flowers separately, okay? The root refers to anything below the surface of the soil. Arguably, that might be the most interesting part of the plant, is what's happening beneath the soil. Up to half the plant, up to half the plant's mass could be contained below the surface and we'll never see it. Kind of like an iceberg, okay? Now, stems then, of course, are support structures, the central structure there. And then leaves are the photosynthetic organs of the plant. So most photosynthesis is occurring in the leaves, okay? Now, again, these are plant parts, not necessarily the tissues. So roots, what do? Well, they absorb water and nutrients from the soil. So although plants make their own sugar, they still need elements like nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus from the soil, okay? They also anchor plants to the ground. They protect the plant from harmful soil, bacteria, and fungi. As we're learning more about plants, though, if you wanted to go into botany, one of the things you might study is how plants talk to each other. And that often happens through their roots. So the fungal networks that grow on the roots in the soil, some of those are beneficial, not harmful. Just like some bacteria are beneficial to us, some fungi are beneficial to plant roots. So it just really depends. They can be harmful or hurtful, okay? Plants, thinking back to like mosses, not only do they hold themselves in place, but they also prevent erosion because they hold the soil in place, okay? So in areas where plants or forests have been cut down, you start to see that soil blowing away, okay? And if plants are there, they're holding that soil in place. Roots, sorry, final thing, can also be used for storage. So if a plant has excess sugar, it can store it in the roots for later use, okay? So that's important too. Root storage, we think that's pretty delicious. So things like potatoes that we eat, those are storage structures for plants. Potatoes are made of starch for the most part. And what's in starch, or I'm sorry, what's in a potato that we eat, starch. We make French fries out of that, okay? Popcorn is just starch. It's the starch that a corn plant puts into its seeds for its developing embryos. But if you heat it up and pop it, that starch then expands, okay? And that's what you're eating, okay? Well, so like that popcorn example, that would be a seed, not the root. But if you're talking about any tubers, like sweet potatoes, anything like that, yes, those are storage structures, yes. So if you ever hear of an animal like pigs that like dig down into the roots, that's what they're going after, tubers, which are storage structures. okay? Now, that's also related though to reproduction, right? Because what does a new plant need? Starch, because before it can photosynthesize, right? Until you can perform photosynthesis, you just have whatever your parents left for you, which is in that seed, okay? Or that tuber, if you're a potato. Okay, so we already talked about this. The only thing I didn't mention about stems is that they are transport structures. So they think of stems like a highway that nutrients, water, sugar pass through to get to different parts from one part of the plant to another. They can also be defensive structures. If you've ever accidentally held a rose and stabbed yourself with one of the thorns, you know that the stem can also be a barrier, a protective barrier, and even have defenses on it, okay, to prevent predation from herbivores. So if you've never thought of it that way, a deer is a plant predator. So think about what would a plant do to protect itself from predation, okay? In the mid to late 90s in Kenya, in some of the game parks, they were noticing that some of these big antelope, these kudu, were just like dropping dead. And they were healthy, right? They weren't like sick. They didn't have a bacterial disease. They were rebounding, so it had been an environmental success story, and no one could figure out what was happening, okay? What they discovered was that these antelope had a high, they were poisoned, basically. And there had been a drought, and the plants in the area started producing more toxins because obviously they were stressed, right? So they're stressed because they don't have enough water, so they can't photosynthesize as much. They're lacking nutrients, so they can't lose what they do have. So what do? They pump their stems and leaves full of tannins, which are poisonous to mammals. And they actually poison these antelope with these toxins. So we didn't ever think, and these aren't like a goat. These animals weigh hundreds of pounds, right? So these are big animals. So plants can defend themselves. So keep that in mind. Then finally, photosynthetic organs that we call leaves. Take a moment the next time you're looking at a plant before it's too late, before October, November, right? And just think about how much surface area that leaf has and how genius it is that each leaf spreads out as much as possible to capture sunlight, right? Making the most of the space available to it. Then each of these leaves can also open and close their stomata, which are on the underside of the leaf, mostly. Remember, we're going to go look at those next week with some nail polish, okay? If you're at home and you want to do it and you're remote, you can just get some clear nail polish. You'll be able to do the same exact thing we do, okay? And you'll be able to see the stomata. And that's how gases get in and out of the leaf. So if there's a drought, they can close so that they're not losing water vapor. When conditions are better, they open back up, and then photosynthesis can occur more quickly. Okay. So those are the plant parts. Now these are the tissues that make up these parts. Okay. So you've got dermal tissue, vascular tissue, and ground tissue. Every part of the plant, for the most part, has all of these tissues in it. So it's not like, oh, only this tissue is found here. All plant parts have these tissues, okay? Now, this picture isn't great. I'm not a good artist, so clip art is about what I have to work with here. But if you look at this, okay, you can see that you've got a root, a stem, and a leaf. Each one of these organs has all three types of tissue. Okay, so if you're on Zoom, I'll use the arrow pointer here. Dermal tissue, what does that word dermal make you think of? Yeah, skin. That's what I always think of when I hear anything dermal. I think of skin. And dermal tissue is just the outer layer of tissue in a plant, okay? So in each of these, that would be this little line outlining the plant. That would be the dermal tissue. Notice that no matter where you are in the plant, you need dermal tissue, okay? Now, vascular tissue is xylem and phloem. That's nutrients flow through those. So those are basically like the circulatory system of the plant. And you can see here, here's the vascular tissue in the roots. Each of these little cavities here is the vascular tissue in the stem. And then there's vascular tissue in the leaf, okay? And it's really easy. Everything that's not vascular or dermal tissue is ground tissue. That's it. And that's it. That's all. Those are the three types of tissue in plants. Now, it's more complicated, of course. There's certain types of ground tissue and things like that, but we're not going to get too much into that. So for our purposes, okay, we will try to identify these three types of tissue in these three parts of a plant. Okay? I'm not going to read this one to you. I think this one's pretty straightforward, what dermal tissue does. Any questions on that? We talked about this yesterday kind of with the evergreens. We talked about the waxy cuticle. We talked about how they're thicker so that it's not as easy for water to escape. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, now, we saw this in the video on Monday, okay? These trichomes that are actually like predatory features. So these are actually included in the dermal tissue. Anything like thorns or stuff like that, that's dermal tissue. Anything that's growing out of this outer layer, okay? And then in roots, in dermal tissue, there are actually little hairs, and we call those root hairs. Now, once again, remember, everything always goes back to surface area. So what do root hairs do? They increase the surface area of the plant's roots. Remember, plants don't really move. They're not like hunters. So if there's a water drop over there, right, and the root is over here in another area, okay, that root, the only way to get to it is to have extensions that go out, okay? And these root hairs do that. They extend the surface area of the roots. That increases a plant's access to water and nutrients in the soil. Okay. Any questions about vascular tissue? We've talked a lot about these. You watched a video on it last night. Any questions on this? Okay, so in vascular tissue, or in this picture, I'm sorry, this is the vascular tissue. Okay? So you've got xylem that transports water and dissolved minerals, and then phloem. Phloem transports sugar from the leaves to the roots, but some water can also be transported there if it needs to go into different places in the plant. Okay? Now, ground tissue is everything else. It's the tissue in between the vascular tissue and the dermal tissue. Okay, any questions on that? Now, there are different kinds, parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma. They're fun to say, but we're not going to get too much into the differences between those, okay? There are different functions of ground tissue. Like think about like celery, right? Celery is like really crunchy, right? That's a different, that tissue has different characteristics than say like a tomato, right? So there can be differences in the ground tissue, but generally speaking, it's whatever is not vascular or dermal, okay? So what does it do? It's a support structure. It can be used for storage, okay? And it is also where photosynthesis takes place in the leaves. So photosynthesis actually takes place in ground tissue, which makes sense, right? It doesn't occur on the surface and it doesn't occur in the veins of the plant. So then it's got to occur in the ground tissue. Questions on that? Okay. Okay. So I'm going to stop there.